Thank you for coming out anyway, and helping us really to spread the word about Holocaust. The reason we've got microphones is that we want to record it on YouTube, and we're going to see if we can get a bit more of the message out on a new part of the subject that we've taught in the past on Holocaust, a new section which is about education. We've taught various sections of Holocaust. And one of my favorites was transport, trains in Holocaust, and how people were transported, and how we could show that in the 42,500 camps and ghettos that were established throughout German occupied territory, nearly everybody in Germany knew what was happening. If they didn't know that people were being killed en masse, they certainly knew that Jews were being rounded up and taken to special facilities. Sometimes those facilities would be in their own town, and that's something that I enjoy teaching, because there is such a denial about Holocaust today, particularly from the second generation of the people who perpetrated the act of Holocaust, and certainly from governments, but also denial from countries such as Lithuania and Latvia and Romania and Belarus, who all those countries having had killing facilities established in those countries, today they deny that anything ever happened. So Holocaust education is really important in terms of combating denial. And denial is one of the stages of genocide. I'm sure you know that. We've got a banner here which it talks about the 8 stages of genocide. Some academics say there are 10 stages to genocide, but I've kind of I'm using 8 stages of genocide because they're a little bit clearer to understand. So if you want to look at these banners after you, please do so, because they contain a lot of information. But the last part of a genocide is when it's finished and governments or the perpetrators deny that it ever happened. And we see Holocaust denial taking place today throughout the world. Certainly in the Arab nations, Holocaust is denied. And certainly amongst some academics who are anti-Semitic, Holocaust is denied. So we need to keep teaching about Holocaust. We also feel here that in Father's house that we need to go out on the streets and teach. And like yesterday, we were out, Dave and Margaret and Ruth and others were on the street in Chester yesterday doing surveys, asking people what they know about Holocaust. And we've yet to analyze those. But as you will know, some people don't know anything at all. And certainly they don't know there was 42,500 camps and ghettos. Usually the answer when you ask how many camps and ghettos, the usual 6 were given. And also some people didn't know or weren't very clear about who the victims were and who the perpetrators were. Because as we know in Holocaust, it wasn't just the Nazis from Germany who perpetrated the crimes. It was also people from Lithuania of all religions, the Christian religions, Protestant and Catholics, who perpetrated the crimes of Holocaust. And they were from various countries: Poland, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, and clearly Germany, Austria, and the Bavarian countries. So it's a huge subject, Holocaust, and actually I did a course during COVID, which took 8 weeks to complete. We did it on Zoom. I don't know, people were fed up with COVID, weren't they? They were sitting at home, and I had an audience which was easy to grab hold of because, it was a change from Coronation Street. So we did this course on Zoom, but the extent of Holocaust can't actually be taught even in 8 weeks. It's a huge, massive subject, and many academics are still studying certain aspects of it because records are only just now coming out in certain aspects of Holocaust. I did a graduation in Yad Vashem over a period of 4 years on the subject of Holocaust, and when I finished, I realized I knew nothing about Holocaust because it is extensive. And then Becky went for a week, and it sparked something in you, didn't it, Becky? And and those researchers that taught us, some of them have died now. They've died, and there are new researchers who are going to the archives in Germany and in these other countries that I mentioned, and finding things out from archives that have been buried since the end of the Second World War. I went to Neuengamme, to an archive um, there, and dug up information on church complicity with the Neuengamme camp and the business relationship that the church had with the Neuengamme camp in northern Germany that nobody else had found. And I know in that archive there are other things that need to be discovered to expose the horrors of what happened in Holocaust and to bring about a better understanding. And and that's why tonight I'm trying to bring about a better understanding of an aspect of Holocaust called education, which is the education of not only church small children, but the education of older children, the kind of 16, 17 years of age children in Germany, which produced a anti-Semitic fighting force of young men and women who were easily put into positions where they would gladly, and I say that gladly, kill innocent victims, mainly Jews, because Jews became the target of the teaching and the hate, the incitement of hatred in not only Germany but the other countries that I've spoken about. And that education with those young people caused ordinary people like you and I, and particularly you younger guys here, to believe that you were protecting the German nation from a group of people who were Jews who were trying to take over Germany and destroy it. Of course, that wasn't true, and that was the issue, really. That the what young people were being taught about Jews was absolutely untrue, but it caused them to hate Jews, which enabled them to kill ordinary men, women, and children just because they were Jews. And it was a very complicated process, the education process. But what it enabled was the young people to be able to actually dehumanize the people they were killing, so they didn't see them as human. And I've got a banner here, which is an original photograph from a man, a professor of history in Minsk University, who I met when I went to Minsk, and he gave me a series of photographs. I was telling Dave earlier on about it, and he 5 of the photographs you could just make out what was there. He was given them by his father, and they'd never been published, and he couldn't get them out of Minsk, out of Belarus at that time. But he asked me if I could do anything with them, and I brought them back. And this one has been put on a Photoshop, a photo enhancing piece of software, so that you can see a little bit better what was going on. But it's a man in uniform. You find it probably hard to see there from where you are, but it's a man in uniform who is standing on bodies in a pit of bodies, and he's about to shoot a mother and a young girl. Probably we think she's probably about 5 or 6 years of age. But it was the education and the propaganda that so twisted the mind of that perpetrator and thousands of other perpetrators, so that they were in the right mental state to be able to kill somebody in those circumstances. And that is horrific to think of, but it happened, and that's the reality. So how did it happen in terms of education of children? And that's what we're going to look at. Um, the Nazis aimed to indoctrinate the younger population through reforming the education system. So it was the Nazi Party wanted to change things to fit with their not only their vision but also their desire to become a very powerful imperialistic nation and take over the countries of Europe. And they needed to have support, and they needed young people to support them and to continue to support them because young people are the future. And the Nazi Party understood this very, very well and planned an education system that would enable the support of Hitler and his regime, but also to be able to so that they could do their bidding. And that so the Nazi Party really understood that. They aimed to de-intellectualize education. They didn't want education to provoke people to ask questions or think for themselves. And that's very important because when you come to um, uh, uh, educate people in a way that that would indoctrinate them and have them do what you want, you don't want them to think outside the box that you give them to think in. You want them to think like you. You want them to be a class, a people who will think in the same way as their leaders think. So you don't want them um, to be researching. You don't want them to be looking at other aspects of life. You certainly, as far as the Nazi Party was concerned, you didn't want them to believe that any other political group or any other grouping within leadership was of value. And what the Nazi Party did was demonize other parties, the Weimar Republic for one, but also the Bolsheviks, the communists. They demonized them so young people would grow up thinking those people were bad, that they were evil, and that we've in what they were taught is that if we destroy them first, then we will live. If we don't, they will overrun us and they will kill us. So it was that kind of mindset. They also didn't want children to study themselves only the material that they gave them to study. It wasn't uh, it wasn't a way of educating children per se. So that if you want to do politics, you want to do history, you want to do geography, you couldn't do that. You had to do what the Nazi Party gave you to learn from an education point of view, and we're going to look at some of those things. So so the Nazi Party, when they took control in 1933, had already got plans for the education of young people. And this is a picture of young people in school. You can see them very tiny. Can you see that picture? I know people on the PowerPoint on YouTube won't be able to see it, but they're little tiny tots, aren't they, in a classroom? And what we have there is the insignia of the Nazi Party, the swastika, and also the insignia of the SS. Can you see the insignia of the SS? The SS were looked at by children as being a crack unit of great men, powerful men, who were honourable men, who were saving the country, and therefore the children were taught to look up to the SS, and the SS were made up of their parents, of family members, young men. Uh, they were recruited from the young people of Germany, from the student grouping, and they were willing to kill and willing to fight based on what they'd been taught. So these children looked up to the SS. That insignia there is the insignia of a blood group. So every SS officer had their blood taken. So if they were killed, and they could be traced back to that, they could be identified through blood. And the other thing about that was that the German government were very keen that only Aryan blood, only non-Jewish blood, was part of their plan to promote the German Aryan race. So if you had an insignia of the SS, which was actually tattooed under here, then They knew you weren't Jewish, you weren't an infiltrator. And that helped us after the war, because at the end of the war, there were people who were trying to escape Germany who had committed terrible crimes, and the SS, 9,000 of Ukrainian SS were allowed into the UK, and we know they were SS because their medical records show that they had the SS tattoos under their arm. So, and they were allowed to come into the UK after the war, 1945 and 46, and they got jobs in the steel industry and the coal industry, and worked in the industrial sector. And as we know as well, many of the SS and many of the leaders of the Nazi Party were actually taken to America and used on scientific projects because they were very clever people. Many of them were scientists. And you can read about that in a book called Operation Paperclip. So, these young people, these tiny tots, were being taught from a very young age to respect and love the Nazi Party, and certainly to give honor to Hitler. Now, the every education authority, and we know from here, and some of you are teachers and some of you are involved in teaching, everybody has to have a director of education. And they are the guys who say what the curriculum is, don't they? They're the ones who guide us in the curriculum. In this country, we have government doing that, and then it's passed down, and education ministers uh, direct schools as to what they should teach. And this is Bernhard Rust, who was the Minister of Education for the Bavarian area of Germany. And I'll read you a little bit about him. Shortly after Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, Rust was appointed as the Prussian Minister for Science, Culture and Public Education. Sorry, I said he was Bavarian. It's not. The Prussian Minister for Science. On 1st of May 1934, he was selected as Reich Minister of Science, Education and National Culture. Now, the Prussian Minister for Education was in charge of education for the eastern side of the German occupied areas. That would be Poland, Romania, the eastern side there. And as Reichmaster, he was absolutely in charge of what was taught in all those schools going out into the east. Now, I've got something going on my screen here, but it doesn't matter. He said on his appointment, he said, "Today we stand in a bitter struggle for existence against Bolshevism." Bolshevism was communism. "I appeal to the Christian churches of both confessions to join with us against this enemy in defense of our living values and belief and morality." And he ordered a reduction in the number of secular schools and requested all teachers that they should attend church. Now, some of you may have been taught that the Nazi Party were a group of people who were maybe paganists or occultists, or who were certainly not Christian, but Hitler professed to be a Christian, and he supported any Christian activities. And Rust professed his Christian faith, although obviously we don't believe that they were Christian, but that's what they said because they believed they were Christian. So Rust wanted to get rid of secular schools because he wanted to bring in Christian teaching. Now, how many of you would say that was a good thing? Most people would say that. We say today, don't we? Oh, we need Christian teaching back in schools. But it depends what type of Christian teaching that we bring back in schools. And it's something we really need to think about, because what Rust and others understood of Christian teaching is that their battle was against the Jews. That's what they understood, and that's what they taught in the schools. Of course, if you had a secular school, there was no input about uh, uh, Jews being Christ killers, because that was part of the propaganda. there was no input in secular schools about that, but there was in Christian schools because the Christians in Germany, who represented 95% of Germany, 35% were Catholic, and the remainder were Protestant. They were anti-Semitic to the extent that they promoted anything which would uh, vilify Jews and actually bring about their destruction or expulsion from the land. So they understood it as part of their Christian faith to get rid of Jews who were opposed to the Christian faith, because that's what they were told. So if Rust could get his members, his schools rather, to teach that narrative, then already you're teaching children to hate Jews and therefore go out and carry out whatever action you want to take against the Jewish population, whether it be to round them up and to gather them together and then to ultimately either expel them or kill them. So Rush wanted to make sure that that was the case, that he had input through the churches into the schools, because he couldn't do it all himself. And churches carry authority, as do teachers. So, he also made it a direction that teachers should attend churches, and teachers who wouldn't attend churches were not given the job of teaching, because that's where they were fed with their anti-Semitism in the church, which is quite startling, isn't it? Rust was a very clever man, and he promoted all these anti-Semitic narratives through not only the teachers but also through the church, and he professed his faith as well. Then this man here, Hans Schem, was the Minister of Education for Bavaria. And I'll read you a little bit about him. Hans Schem was appointed Bavarian Minister of Education on the 28th of March, 1933, as Hitler took power. He said on his appointment, "It is henceforth the goal of the Education Ministry that every child in Bavarian schools shall be made familiar with the principles of Christian and national statesmanship. Faith in God and the personality of the teacher must be expressed in a realistic instruction filled with religious sincerity." So I guess, having read that statement on his appointment, you would believe he was Christian, wouldn't you? I think that we would all say that. And he wanted this Christian teaching in the schools. On the 26th of April 1934, he formally restored obligatory religious instruction in all schools and obligatory attendance by all students in all church festivities, ordering that all sports and recreational activities be banned on Sundays to ensure children's attendance at church services. So he made sure that there was nothing happening on a Sunday that would stop children, young people, going to church. Now, on the face of it, that sounds good. We hear, don't we, children aren't going to church enough. They've lost their Christian faith, but it depends what that Christian faith is teaching. And I don't want to have to repeat that, but my speciality really is on Christian anti-Semitism, and I can tell you what they were teaching these young people about Jews was horrific, absolutely frightening. And so we see that in the Bavarian area, which is Austria, which is France, and the more western side of Germany, that's what children were being taught in schools, because like Rust, Shem used schools and the education system to teach anti-Semitism, and also to teach about Hitler being a man of God and somebody who was protecting the country. So these two men were very influential in the early years of the Nazi regime, and actually their influences and the influences of the church and the teaching of children influenced the way people thought when in 1939 the war started and Jews became the target of German oppression and ultimately the target of murder of Jews. Um, and one of the things that is interesting about that narrative is that children were manipulated and indoctrinated to believe certain things about other countries, particularly the UK, because we were their number one target, and we gave them a hard time in the war, didn't we? And but German children were taught that the people of the UK had no morals, that we didn't have a real Christian faith, that actually we were a pagan nation, and people to be feared. And in 1938, um, uh, Hitler had asked uh, 34 nations of Europe and other parts of the world to come together at a place called Evian in France, where he told these nations that he was about to do something with the Jewish population of the countries in which he was going to occupy. And this is before the war. And he asked those countries to take some of the Jewish refugees, some of the Jewish people, rather than him do what he was going to do with them. And actually, the Evian conference only lasted for 4 hours, and all the nations turned down the offer and left Jews to the what ultimately became their demise through Hitler. So we have a lot of responsibility. Now, what the teachers taught was that, the UK didn't want Jews because Jews are dangerous. They didn't want them. Of course, that wasn't the reason, but he took every opportunity to get the teachers to teach that, to get the churches to teach that. And you can see how truth is twisted and brought into a place where you can actually use it to bring people to hate certain people groups. And Rust and Shem were part of that teaching as well. Now, we tend to think that the education of German children was through men like Rust and Shem, but the Nazi regime very cleverly used women as the mothers to teach the children how to hate Jews or why to hate Jews, and to look at the Nazi ideology and to follow the Nazi party. Now, like I know, that children, when they're being brought up in those days, were brought up by the mother. The father may be out in the army, he may be working, but he didn't have the influence that the women had, and Hitler knew this. And so did the regime know that. So they indoctrinated the women in order that they could indoctrinate the children. Now, my view of Hitler is that when you study his past, is that he learned from his mother, Clara Hitler, who came from a poor background, but she they lived in a little village outside Austria. But she was a very devout Catholic, and she learned a great deal of anti-Semitism through the church. And when you look at what was being taught in the church then, it was highly anti-Semitic at the time Hitler was growing up. And clearly, Clara would have told her son, Hitler, about the Jewish people, because he was already anti-Semitic when he wrote Mein Kampf in 1923, when he was imprisoned after the First World War. And I've got a copy of Mein Kampf here. Has anybody ever read it, or have you seen it? I'm not saying you should read Mein Kampf, but it does give you an idea of Hitler professing his Christian faith to begin with, but also the twisted understanding of why he hated Jews, and the actual desire that he had in 1923 to get rid of the Jewish people. And Hitler wrote this whilst he was in prison. Some of this teaching was teaching on eugenics, which came from the United States of America. That teaching came from the United States, and it's about trying to bring about a pure people, and in terms of Germany, a pure Aryan race. and he learned a lot about eugenics from the American eugenics program in 1923. The Americans learned it from us, and then they had a huge eugenics program in America. And actually, Winston Churchill was the founder of the eugenics program in the UK, and before the war. Um, but but the eugenics program was something that Hitler used to teach children that Germans had to be a pure race, and they had to have pure blood, and that was one of the things he used. And the written, as you know, when if something is written down, I've written a little book, and I've given you copies of that little book, Rose Tinted Memories. You tend to read it, and you kind of believe to an extent what the author's saying, unless you check it out, don't you? So you need to check out my book, but things like the protocols of the Elders of Zion were promulgated throughout Germany during this time, and children were taught about these protocols. And the protocols were something that was written about in Russia in 1880, and it was the story uh, uh, of Jews who had met together to take over the world. That was absolutely not true. But the protocols were written by Russian anti-Semites, Russian political leaders, who hated Jews, and they wanted to send out a conspiracy theory about the Jews. So they made up what they called protocols of a meeting that took place with Jews. Well, of course, the meeting didn't take place, but the fictitious meeting, as they recorded it, was that Jews were wanting and planning and to take over the world, and to try and gain the wealth of the world. And as a result of these protocols, we see the pogroms in Russia, which saw thousands of Jews being killed by Russian communities because they feared Jews. And then Hitler took on the protocols, and he used them and said, "Listen, Jews want to take over the world." But he then had these protocols taught in the schools, certainly to the Hitler Youth. So he used all these sort of things. And then in America, we see that during the Second World War, that uh, the protocols were also taught primarily by wealthy businessmen, and one of them was Henry Ford, the motor vehicle manufacturer. Do you remember Henry Ford? Most of you. He lived in Detroit, and Henry Ford employed a number of journalists to write something called the International Jew, and he he wrote this booklet, which was based on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, to say that Jews want to take over America and want to take all the wealth out of America. And you can have a look at these after, and and uh, and that caused people like Roosevelt to think twice if they were to allow Jews to come into America, because the American people had been indoctrinated, and American children had been indoctrinated by this teaching that Jews want to take over the world. And actually, Roosevelt refused entry to many Jews. There's a story about a ship. Many of you will know about this ship called the St. Louis, which carried 250 Jewish passengers uh, from Europe to go to Cuba. Cuba wouldn't allow them in. When they came to the coast of America, Roosevelt wouldn't allow them in. They came back to Europe. We took some in, but then the rest were killed in the camps, in the murder camps. So indoctrination does have a huge effect, even in countries other than the German occupied territories. It had an impact on our country as well, through a guy called Oswald Mosley, who you would have heard of, who was an anti-Semite, who again used the protocols of the Elders of Zion to bring about fear against the Jews. But in regard to women, I went off piste a bit there, didn't I? But in regard to women, um, he used women to actually promote anti-Semitism with the children. Now, he established a National Socialist Women's Organization, and one of their goals uh, after 1931, when they were formally recognized, was to teach the children the fundamentals of Nazi ideology, of a national rebirth, because that's what Hitler was saying. We're going to make Germany new. Purity of race, which is all about anybody who wasn't an Aryan was a mongrel and they should be destroyed. And that's what his intention was with the Jews. And he carried it out, obviously. And the indoctrination of youth to fight against what they were taught by the National Socialist Women's Organization, the Jewish Marxist spirit, because it was taught that Jews were running the Communist Party and they were all Marxists. They were against political Germany and they were against the growth of Germany. They were against capitalist Germany, who was going to bring wealth to the country. And they were taught that, and they were demonized in that way. And of course, the National Women's Socialist Organization actually played a big part in teaching the children from that age in the home. And I think that's what happened to Hitler. He was taught in the home, not through this organization, but in that same way. And he knew that that was very effective. So when children went to school, they learned anti-Semitism in the school. And when they went home, it was reinforced. So these children had no chance really of knowing what the truth was. And they also were taught through propaganda. Now we've got one of the second one of the pull-ups over there. I teach on propaganda because propaganda, in terms of art in propaganda, is probably the most effective way of indoctrinating young people, particularly. And some of you will have seen this particular um, um, slide on the Hidden Treasures course that I teach. But if you look at that slide, you can see it up there on the screen. I wonder if I could just ask you, Becky, to take the microphone around. If anybody's got a comment about that, and what I'm going to ask you is you probably don't understand the German heading to this slide. And I'm glad you don't, because I want you to tell me what that picture shows you. Can you hand a microphone out if anybody's got a comment? Have you got anyone? I need you to have the microphone so we can get it on YouTube. What would you say that picture was about? Oh, you can't see it. Oh, right, okay. It's the crucifixion. You know, I don't think the shape is so important. The caption at the bottom of that is "The Jews killed Jesus," and that's what the caption is. So children, that was in schools, that was in magazines, it was in newspapers. The children were indoctrinated with that message, and that message also came strongly through the German church, who taught that practically weekly in their churches. Jews killed Jesus. Well, is that true? Not at all. It was the Romans. Um, but it was an important message that got through propaganda. So if you were being brought up in a Christian church, whether Catholic or Lutheran or whatever, a positive Christianity church, then this is the message you had. And of course, Jews were the enemy of Christianity. That's what the ultimate message is. And then we have another slide here, which is the picture of a school children being taught about eugenics. Now, the eugenics, as I've said, was something that was promoted in the UK, in America, and certainly after 1923 in Germany. which was to bring about a perfect race. So they needed to identify the characteristics of a Jew to teach the children what the characteristics were. And one of the things they did was to teach that Jews have big noses. So they taught children to identify, and I'm going to show you another picture about this in a minute, to identify Jews through their noses. But this was clearly an attitude of indoctrinating, because the Nazi regime already knew who the Jews were, because from 1923 onwards, after Hitler came out of prison, he worked with the American IBM company. Who's ever heard of IBM? I think we've all heard of IBM, have we, computers? Who had created something called the Hollerith machine. And the Hollerith machine was a data collecting machine. And it stamped cards just with little pinpricks. And it recorded data about people. And just from 1933 onwards, Hitler brought over IBM specialists with this Hollerith machine to identify and record who the Jews were in Germany to begin with, but then Austria, and then Poland and other places. And he gave these machines to people like doctors, teachers, and pastors, because they were able to identify who Jews were. If you were a doctor, you would be able to identify who the Jews were in your patients. Many were identified obviously through circumcision, and if you knew that a man had been circumcised, he was Jewish, and likely his wife was Jewish. So they were able to use the Hollerith machine to identify Jews, not only through just the name, but the date of birth and their addresses. And from the information that you had within your medical records. And they had to do this. They were told it was something they needed to do for the state, but many of did voluntarily. In regard to pastors, they used the Hollerith machine to collect data on who were Jewish converts, because in the middle of the war, Jewish converts were expelled from the churches and many were taken to the camps. So they collected data on that, and also teachers did exactly the same. Who were the Jewish children in my school or in my class? Because they were the ones who didn't celebrate Christmas and celebrated this thing called Passover, and they identified through that. So teachers would record on these Hollerith machines, and all this data was brought into a central place where they knew who the Jews were. And then through the education system, they taught children to hate Jews and to think about the eugenics as being something very important for Germany and for the health of the nation. And that's what the terms they used for the health of the nation, because Jews would taint the blood of an Aryan. It was dangerous to have the blood of Jews in your bloodline. So it was something that children were brought up with. So eugenics and the teaching of eugenics was very important to the regime for making children frightened of Jews. And this next slide shows a Jew as a toadstool, wearing a toadstool's hat and a Star of David. And what would that make you think of? Poison, yeah. So Jews are poison, and if children, that's absolutely right. So if Jews thought, if students thought Jews were poison, that they were dangerous, that if you had anything to do with them, it would affect all sorts of things, your health, etc., then you're going to hate them, or you're going to fear them, and fear brings hate. So they used these ideas to indoctrinate children. Now, under the restoration of the Professional Civil Service Act of the 7th of April 1933, just 3 months after Hitler became Chancellor, all Jewish teachers and teachers with undesirable political beliefs, and they would be Marxists, communists, were dismissed. And also they would be Jehovah Witnesses were another example of that. And I don't know, does anybody know why Jehovah Witnesses were chosen for persecution? No, the reason Jehovah Witnesses were used for persecution because they were not part of the indoctrination regime against the Jews. The Christian church was militaristic. It was something that it was very nationalistic. Christians were taught that they needed to be part of a force to fight on for Christ's will that Jews should be killed because they taught that Christ was against Jews. So the group Jehovah Witnesses were absolutely opposed to that narrative. They stood up against Hitler. They stood up against that teaching, and therefore they were taken, and many of them were killed in the murder camps. I think there were 7,000 altogether who stood up against Hitler, where Christians didn't, or very, very few stood up against Hitler and the teaching because they'd been indoctrinated, but the Jehovah Witnesses hadn't. But they removed under this act, the Professional Civil Service Act, they removed Jews from the education system. In universities, all Jewish professors were dismissed. This had a large impact as those professors made up 12% of all German professors. And this group also comprised of 25% of Germany's Nobel Prize winners. Well, we see today Jews becoming Nobel Prize winners, but having such an effective blessing all over the world, don't we? But because Germany hated Jews so much, they were willing to get rid of some of the most academic, the cleverest of people within their community, as they got rid of doctors, Jewish doctors and nurses. They were willing to risk losing huge portions of the population who were benefiting the country just because they hated Jews so much. So the schools and the universities became void of Jewish influence in any way, shape, or form. This act also made membership of the Nazi Party compulsory for all teachers. The National Socialist Teachers League created in 1929 became responsible for the control and education of teachers following Nazi rise to power, and all teachers were required to attend a 1-month compulsory Nazi training course, which emphasized Nazi ideology and the importance of advocating the regime's ideas. So you can see the children had no chance, did they? These teachers would come back enthused, full of love and admiration for Hitler and his Nazi party, and they would teach that to the children. And also on these courses, they were taught anti-Semitism, bringing it back to the children. New textbooks were introduced, which were racist, and they promoted ideas such as the need for something called Lebensraum, and that word means space or room, instilling the ideas that Germany need more land, specifically for Germans and the Aryan race, meaning imperialism. So Germany, the teaching was that we need more land, so we have to take land and we have to occupy Czechoslovakia. We have to occupy Poland because we are going to increase the Aryan race because we are going to become great in the world. And we are going to we're going to occupy these countries, and we are going to rule these countries, and they will be far better off because of it. And this imperialistic view was instilled into teachers and promoted in the schools because the children felt a part of something very, very big and very, very important for their future. Hitler wanted a pure Aryan race. So to occupy as many countries as he could, any textbooks used to educate students had to be approved by the Nazi Party. So you couldn't just buy a textbook off a shelf in a library. You couldn't read it. It had to be promoted by the Nazi Party. And many of the books were um, things like Christian books which have had a lot of church art in them, showing that actually Jews had lost the authority of the church and they killed Christ. And then the Bibles and religious books were changed because in the German church actually published Bibles that didn't have anything that would identify Jesus as a Jew. So they removed Matthew 1 genealogy, for instance, John the Baptist. They removed anything that was Jewish in the Bible, which seems impossible, and that's why they were very small Bibles. But they didn't have the Old Testament. And actually the German church was teaching that Jesus was actually an Aryan from Galilee, because Galilee was the Galilee of the Gentiles, and he actually was German. So that's what people like Gerhard Kittel and Walter Grundwig, who were leaders in the German church, taught. Grundmann is named, Walter Grundmann. So, and as I say, the Bible was changed to take away his Jewishness, and that was passed on to the parents in the church, to the children who had to go to church, and in the school. So again, the children had very little opportunity to find out what the truth was, and it was very difficult for them. This again is the part of the eugenics program. This book was meant for 16, 17, 18-year-olds who were to be given extra education, university education, so they could become Nazi leaders. And they were taught very deeply about eugenics, and very specifically, you can see this book here. It talks about the size of a nose. I mean, it's totally offensive and racist today, but in Germany, it was part of the education. And that's just an example of one of the books. Oh, I've missed that one. Now, the Nazis had transformed Germany from a democracy into a single-party dictatorship, which enabled them, and that's the danger. That was the danger to Germany, that Hitler wouldn't have any opposition, and he didn't have any opposition once he took power. He wouldn't allow any further elections. He wouldn't allow democracy to take place. So as part of the process, the Nazi German regime introduced Nazi ideology into all aspects of life in Germany, including education, arts and politics, in clubs, government and policies. And this process was called Nazification. So as you can see, the whole of Germany was Nazified in terms of their understanding of the future of Germany. Now, from 1920s onwards, the Nazi Party created something called the Nazi Youth. And they targeted the youth because they were a special audience for propaganda. And these messages that they gave created a movement of youth who were dynamic, resilient, forward-looking, and hopeful. Millions of German young people were won over to Nazism through the teachings of extracurriculum teachings in classrooms and after-school studies. And in 1933, they created something called the Hitler Youth. And that had approximately 100,000 members. But by the end of the year, this figure had increased to more than 2 million. So you can see that the indoctrination of youth was very effective, because it increased the members. By 1937, membership in the Hitler Youth had increased to 5.4 million before it became mandatory to be in the Hitler Youth in 1939. So before that, in 1937, you volunteered to join the Hitler Youth. And that created this huge membership of 5.4 million. That's 1.5 times greater population than Wales. So it's a huge number of young people that he was influencing. And they gave them uniform. This is one of the uniforms of a girl, because the Hitler Youth were both male and female, and they were given a uniform. And I think, Tom, don't you? A uniform instills pride, doesn't it? It does a number of things, and I know from the police service, it gives you an element of pride, and you feel part of something. You feel part of an effective, important, professional group of people. So they gave these uniforms and to all of the youth, to make them feel part of this one group of Germans who were going to protect Germany from the dangers of Marxism, communism, which was run by Jews. In the classroom and in the Hitler Youth, instruction was aimed to produce race-conscious, obedient, self-sacrificing Germans who would be willing to die for the Führer and the fatherland. Devotion to Adolf Hitler was a key component of the Hitler Youth training. German young people celebrated his birthday, which was the April the 20th, and it was a national holiday and for membership inductions. So they made a big thing of joining the Hitler Youth and supporting Hitler himself. German adolescents swore allegiance to Hitler and pledged to serve the nation and its leader as future soldiers. So they made a promise to serve as soldiers. So this indoctrination was huge. There's an example of Hitler Youth saluting Hitler. This was a mass indoctrination of young people, which caused them to love the Führer, to love the fatherland, to love the Aryan race, and to hate everybody else. And that's how it worked out. Schools played an important role in spreading Nazi ideas to German youth, while censorship removed some books from the classroom. German educators introduced new textbooks that taught students to love Hitler, obedience to state authority, militarism, racism, and anti-Semitism. From the first days in school, German children were imbued with the cult of Adolf Hitler. He was the person on their mind. They had pictures of Adolf Hitler in every classroom. His portrait was a standard fixture in the classroom, and textbooks frequently described the thrill of a child seeing the German leader for the first time. It was something, it's like our children seeing the king for the first time. And some of you may have seen the Queen. And it was quite an exciting thing, isn't it, to see that? And it would be something of great pride. Board games and toys for children served as another way to spread racial and political propaganda to German youth. Toys were also used as propaganda vehicles to indoctrinate children into militarism, using crude anti-Semitic stereotypes and imagery. The themes of games reflect racial hatred. They reflect forced deportations, confiscation of Jewish property, as in a game of Monopoly. And this is a board game which was kind of similar to Monopoly, but it was actually, you won the game by how many Jews you expelled from your area. And this was something that was played in homes. It was played in schools. This is just one of the games, but it's at every stage it promoted anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews, and actually gave the players directions as to how to get rid of the Jews from your whatever point you landed on. So it was part of the indoctrination program. Again, in the Hitler Youth, these games were played on special weekends, etc. They were given these games in their evening classes. Now, The Hitler Youth was founded in 1926, and the original purpose of the Hitler Youth was to train boys to enter the stormtroopers, a Nazi Party paramilitary formation. After 1933, the youth leaders sought to integrate boys um, into the Nazi national community and to prepare them for the service as soldiers in the armed forces and later in the SS. Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls were the primary tools that the Nazis used to shape their beliefs, thinking, and actions of German youth. Youth leaders used tightly controlled group activities, such as those games, and staged propaganda events, such as mass rallies full of ritual and spectacle, to create the illusion of one national community reaching across class and religious divisions that characterized Germany before 1933. Now, religious divisions there were uh, um, denominational divisions, not divisions in terms of Jewishness and Christianity or Islam. There were very few Muslims in Germany during that period. But that religious divisions, there were divisions between Catholics and Protestants, and within the Protestant communion, there were divisions as well. So, what Hitler wanted to do was unify Catholics, Protestants, and he actually did that to quite an effect using people like Goebbels, who many of you know. Goebbels professed to be a Christian, and his aim was to unify the denominations in Christianity, to bring the whole of Germany together as one community, which is what they were trying to teach the youth. And we can see here there the Hitler Youth again, the boys and girls, probably 16, 17, carrying the SS emblem and having fun and in uniform and feeling part of an organization. So how many of you were in the Scouts or Guides? So you felt part of something, didn't you? If you in that you feel as if you're all of one mind and you're all doing a good job. And that indoctrination went through in Germany. That method was used to indoctrinate. In 1936, membership in the Nazi youth groups became mandatory for all boys and girls between the ages of 10 and 17. After school meetings and at weekend camping trips sponsored by the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, the children were trained to become faithful to the Nazi Party and the future leaders of the National Socialist State. And in 1935, the numbers grew exponentially. So I can skip that. Being in the Hitler Youth was an issue of pride, not only for the person in the organization, but for the family. And that picture is a picture of children or young people as a group being pictured together. And that those sort of pictures would be on the mantelpiece in houses because parents were proud of their children being part of the Hitler Youth. And the parents were part of the indoctrination, and then the children who were indoctrinated brought back indoctrination, lies, back into the home. So it was a very, very effective move that the Education Authority facilitated. And at the end of the war, towards the end of the war, we can see that in Germany, the numbers of soldiers were decreasing, and the Allied forces were overtaking them and killing many. And Hitler and the regime needed to recruit young people into the army, and they recruited young children who were absolutely willing to attend and join the army because of what they'd been taught, because it was something they were proud of. But it was the end of the war. And this picture, and it's the last picture that I've got for you, is a picture of a young 16-year-old Willie Hubner being awarded with the Iron Cross in March 1945, and that's at the end of the war. Just shows you that these young people were very proud, 16-year-olds, very proud of fighting for their country. Such was the education and the indoctrination. So that's the end of my presentation, and you've listened to me long enough. But I just wanted to not only just ask you if you've got a question, but if you have a comment or you want to make a statement, I'd love to hear from of your comments on this whole aspect of education. Becky will give you the microphone if you. We're still on YouTube, so I want that to become. I want your question or your comment to be heard on the internet.
Um, right, the way you described how children were educated in Nazi Germany made me think about how Hamas indoctrinated Gazan Arab children. Is there any similarity? Were they influenced by Nazi practices? Because I noticed in videos that I've seen that most of their teachers were women.
Uh, I don't want to get into in a Holocaust study. I can't comment on what's happening in Gaza, but certainly what I can say is that the indoctrination by Germany is is specifically for the West, and I don't think that Hamas took any lead from Germany. I think that was already in um, the minds of Arab nations to some Arab nations to indoctrinate their own children in different ways, and we are aware of how they indoctrinate children. But this was a separate thing, Hannah. I don't think there's any connection. Although what I can say in terms of Holocaust is that Hitler did meet a number of times with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was Yasser Arafat's grandfather. And their plan was, if Hitler was able to win the war, his plan was to uh, round up all the Jews of the Arab nations in the Middle East, and and then murder them en masse. And that agreement was already in place. And he also, as you know, uh, also wanted to murder the Jews of England as well. He put that on the list. Um, but I can't. I don't want to get into the Gaza thing. If I can do that.
In the what you've told us, you mentioned racism as well as anti-Semitism. So, was Hitler's idea to get rid of anybody who wasn't sort of um, uh, Western white? In so would that have included any sort of people with darker skin or whatever?
Yes, that's right. He wanted a pure Aryan race. The racism in Nazi Germany was anti-Semitic as well, because the racism, he saw Jews, and so did the German people, saw Jews as a race, and that's why they brought in the idea of blood. So they were a race of people that had a specific blood type that would um, demonize the blood of the Aryan if it was to be crossed, and that's why he created marriage laws so that Jews couldn't have children with Aryan wives, etc. So it was a blood issue, and that helped the church, who wanted to expel Jews from within the church structure. They said, even though Jews, this is what church leaders said, even though Jews converted, you couldn't take the Jewishness out of them because it was in their blood. So conversion was not a spiritual thing, it was a racist thing. And that the racist thing moved on as well, Ruth, to your question, in terms of eugenics, because people who had epilepsy, etc., and people who had some illnesses were also classed as targets, not because of their race so much, but because of their handicap. So there was a place called Applerbeck in Germany, which was a hospital where children and adults who were infirm or were ill. And one of the cases that I studied was a young boy who was epileptic, they were taken to Applebeck and they were killed there by doctors by injection. So that was a eugenics idea. But there was, yes, there was racism, there was eugenics, and people involved in those stories became victims if they weren't pure, healthy Aryans. Did that answer your question, Ruth? Because I know you. Oh, it was.
I was also thinking of people like people from Africa or India or places like that. I don't know if there were many people in Germany at the time, but I was thinking about the Olympics when the Black American, thank
Jesse
you,
Owens.
Jesse Owens. I was thinking that was what made me think of it.
Yeah, the 1933 Olympics in Berlin, uh, Olympics, there were people from other countries who came in, and it was Munich, wasn't it? Was it Munich or Berlin? I can't remember, Munich or Berlin. But 1933, the Olympics did have people from other countries there, but Hitler was trying to make himself very important with the other nations. So, and we sent people on those Olympics knowing that there was persecution of Jews in 1933, knowing that Hitler was racist. We still tried to have relationship with him and to appease him. So we sent people. America sent people, runners like Jesse Owen, was it? Um, so, so yes, but they were only temporary resident, weren't they? But anybody who was out of the class, I don't think there were that many Indians there. I don't know, but certainly he didn't want anything other than an Aryan race.
The problem of slave labor, I don't think that's been highlighted enough. There seems to be an internal contradiction there, because if you're getting people that you hate to to be employed in a service considered to be important for the prosecution of the war, it seems to open the way to sabotage. And if you don't give them the required amount of calories, then it seems that they will be unable to perform the tasks assigned to them.
Good question. Nothing to do with education, Wilf, but it is a good question, and I can answer that question. The Jewish workforce was really important to the Nazi regime because it was Jews who built Auschwitz. And I'm going to ask Becky in a minute just to tell you about the importance of visiting the camps. It was those who made the bricks. It was Jews who built the railroads. It was Jews who were forced to build armaments. And an example of what you asked about um, the danger of things going wrong with using Jews was the case with Schindler, where Schindler's Jews actually made bombs that didn't work. But as a general rule, Jews were used in the labor force because they wanted to have a workforce that were not fighting, were not part of the soldiering aspect of Germany, but who could build and construct things and be the laborers, be the hod carriers, be the brickmakers, be anything. And if you look at workforces in Germany, and I have, then those Jewish workforces were put into what is known as satellite camps. So, like with Auschwitz, there were 50 satellite camps. They built all the buildings that enabled Auschwitz to run, because Auschwitz just wasn't just Auschwitz-Birkenau and Auschwitz I. There were other things going on there. There was a workforce there that they sent out to build houses, to build structures, to build railroads, to do all those things. And you speak about calories. Each worker was given a specific amount of calories. If you research this, it's really interesting. Just enough to be able to live, to do the type of work they were asked to do. Now, when I looked at the calories of the workforce, if you worked in say, a laundry, because they worked in laundries, they had less calories than the people who were brickmakers. So if I went to Neuengamme, it's one of the places I went. I went there for a number of reasons, but it's near Belsen as well. But Neuengamme was a brickmaking camp, and the people there were given certain calories for making bricks a day. And then when they became diseased, if they got diseases, because they did, that's when they were executed, taken to the gas chambers or shot. But they were given just enough calories to do the work that they had. So very important. The Jewish labor force was absolutely crucial to the Nazi program of expansion. Are there any other comments or?
Yeah, Mike, you've really helped us to understand how thorough the indoctrination process was and how extensive it was. And I'm just wondering, were there any family? Was it impossible for you to bring up children without them being indoctrinated, or were the families who had an alternate, education for their children? I mean, I just read about Bonhoeffer, I think they were schooled at home, his family. So would you say that all children in schools were indoctrinated?
Yeah, so I would, and you were a teacher when you did many years in the teaching profession, and I think when you look at Bonhoeffer, Niemöller, and those guys, they stood out, didn't they? They stood against Nazi Germany. They were also anti-Semitic.
Well, he had a Jewish brother-in-law.
Yeah, he had, yes, but
well, anyway, we'll talk about that.
yeah, that's right. Niemöller was certainly anti-Semitic, and he wanted Jews not to be in positions in churches.
I don't know about
But Bonhoeffer was he was against the political side of things, wasn't he, as well?
He was supportive of Jews. I read quite a deep book about
But
it.
he was an exception, I think. If you was with your teaching background, if you were taught by the director of education that you had to teach this certain curriculum and other teachers were teaching it, then you probably would do that. And nobody would leave your class because that was the norm. You know, the family wanted you to learn, and it was based on Christian ethics, which was dangerous in itself, wasn't it? Because you had a great deal of truth, but also you had in there mixed with lies, like Jews killed Christ and he wasn't a Jew, etc. So you would be proud to send your children there. So you can imagine the dynamics and how difficult it would be to refuse to teach. And if you did refuse to teach, you were taken, or you were thrown out of the school, or you end up in the camps.
So there were, was it the confessing church? There were pastors who didn't wouldn't conform to the Nazi ideology. So
Yes.
they would have been not allowed to
That's right.
educate their
Absolutely.
children
Yeah.
separately.
The confessing church was very small. And Hitler was absolutely opposed. The confessing church, meaning born again people, it was very, very small and very ineffective as well. But they wouldn't play a part in the education system. Absolutely not. It was only those teachers who were, as we've seen, were indoctrinated every month. They would go to swear allegiance to the Nazi party. They'd have to join the Nazi party. And that was an issue. And most Christians did join the Nazi party.
Thank you.
I think that in education, the theory of evolution would have been a grand, useful tool to those who wanted to manipulate the populations in their evil way of thinking. the idea of inferior peoples, the idea that evolution would, by working with the process, would produce the supermen that the Nazis aspired to.
Well, that's part of eugenics, Wilf, isn't it? That's exactly what eugenics is about, isn't it?
I was just thinking about things like art and music. Were what happened because a lot of the Jewish people were great artists and musicians. Was all their work sort of taken out of the way and not taught anymore?
Yeah. I nearly put a slide in about art, Ruth, but anything that the Nazi Party thought was either created by Jews, music or art, was removed from all the education system, and anything that didn't fit either with their ideology was removed. So it wasn't just Jewish; it was a clean sweep in the education community, absolutely clean sweep, and they removed anything that went against the regime or was Jewish. So after Tom, Becky, would you come up and just
So, thinking about rescuers, I heard that Japan and China accepted Jewish refugees. In particular, the Japanese ambassador to Lithuania signed many visas for Jewish refugees to escape to Japan.
yeah, I don't know what the numbers were, Tom, but there were Jewish refugees who were taken to Asian countries. We took 60,000, but we only accepted those Jews who were from Austria or Germany and who were well educated and who were sponsored by families here. So that 60,000 would not include Polish refugees, etc. And I think Japan and China did exactly the same. They were Jewish refugees who could give to society rather than those who were perhaps from the poorer areas who were not quite so well educated. And some visas were given to South American Jews, to Jews by South American countries. And in fact, the St. Louis was carrying Jews who had visas for Cuba. So yes, you're right, it was. But I think one of the things that we have to remember is that we could have saved a lot more Jews, not only Asia, but we could have done. And has anybody heard of the Bermuda Conference of 1943, when Hitler, before he created the murder camps, he asked America and the UK to meet together to devise a plan with him to take 2 million Eastern European Jews, to give them refuge, but as long as they went out of Europe. And he wanted Britain and America to do that. And British politicians and American politicians, leaders, met in Bermuda, and they met for a week. And they studied this idea of the invitation that Hitler gave them to take Jews, and they refused. And those 2 million Jews were the Jews that were taken to places like Auschwitz and they shot in the pits, etc. So we could have saved the lives of 2 million. And in fact, I read Hansard's comments on that. I read a lot of Hansard's long, laborious, boring debates. But in one of these debates over the Jews coming into this country, involved an MP from Devon who said, we don't want to take Jews out of Europe because they won't milk cows on a Saturday. And that's what he said in Parliament. It's just, nobody wanted to take Jews. And you know, when I said about the 9,000 SS officers, they were from the Galzinian Brigade of Ukraine. We brought in 9,000, but after the war, we only allowed 2,700 Jews to come in. So we didn't do very well. And really, the Asian countries and America didn't do very well, really. We could have saved a lot more.
I heard that America only accepted relatives of those who were actually in the country.
Yes, like we did. So they had to have a sponsor.
No, I heard they only
Yeah.
accepted actual relatives, and the relatives had obviously to do the sponsoring. We accepted anyone as long as we could get a sponsor for them.
Well, mainly they were relatives.
Yeah.
Because nobody else wanted to sponsor them, really. I
Yes.
think that was the case. Just on that subject, if you're interested, a book by Louise London, an academic, called Whitehall and the Jews. I think I gave it to you, Dan.
Yes.
It's a really good book to read
I
about.
gave it you back.
Sorry?
I gave it you back.
Did you? Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't always get books back, but